Welcome to the third episode of Stratagems. Today, we are talking about Polaroid and the release of the SX70. My name is Ruben Ugarte, and I'll be your host for today. Now, the first episode was Sears, second episode is Boeing, and third episode, Polaroid, another company from the 20th century, highly influential. This is a name we still use today. Even young kids today, Gen Z and younger, they would use the word Polaroid to talk about this instant photography, instant photograph, right, with the white background and so on. You see it in the cover of the Taylor Swift album. Google searches have been increasing for Polaroid. Polaroid, the company itself, actually exists today. It was sort of revived from the dead about 10 years ago. But we're going to look at Polaroid during the days of Edwin Land, the enigmatic founder, a person who molded the company in his own name, who had this incredible secret military career, highly influential military career for many years, a career that we know about today, but it wasn't well known at the time. Edwin Land is someone that Steve Jobs molded himself after, and many of the things that Edwin Land did, Steve Jobs would then copy. So if you ever seen product launch by Steve Jobs, that came straight from Edwin Land and how he used to approach his shareholder meetings. Polaroid is a company that is known for instant photography, but really behind that is just groundbreaking scientific research that took 10, 20, 30 years to come to fruition. Very, very impressive technical details. We're going to look at this widely popular consumer products, the SX70, the swinger camera, the One Step, the very first ever instant camera, the 95A. And of course, the core of our podcast is the SX70. Released in 1972, it would go on to become this huge success for Polaroid in the 70s. And then, of course, the company will go on to struggle in the 80s and onward. So we'll look at also a bit of the demise of Polaroid. So not much else to say, except enjoy the episode. And we're going to get started with the trial. Part 1. If you're right, the facts at the moment don't matter, because in due course, the facts will catch up with you. It's 1982, and we are in Boston. The Giants just won the Super Bowl. The Lakers are the kings of the NBA, and the Minnesota Twins reign supreme in baseball. Now, you can imagine the downtown harbor of Boston. It's full of boats. The marina is busy. There's that great spring-summer vibe that Boston has. But we are not here for the weather. We are here for a trial. After 5 years of discovery, the Kodak versus Polaroid trial has started. Now, the judge, in this case, there is no jury. Her name is Raya Weikart-Sobel. She was born in Germany in 1931. She is the chief judge of the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts. Now, she has a serious disposition. If you look at her photos, you can get that. But there is an undercurrent of humor and lightness. And we actually see this come out often during the trial, as she has to deal with a lot of technical details from both Kodak and Polaroid. Her staff love her intelligence, and she's definitely more than up to the task. Now, the lead lawyer for Polaroid is named Herbert Schwartz. He's been working his case now for several years, trying to bring it to fruition, and now they're finally in front of the judge, trying to help her understand why this technology that Edwin Land and Polaroid built and that it took them 30 years to invent is actually novel and worth the patents that were originally provided for them. Kodak is trying to prove that the technology is not actually that novel, and in fact, some of the patents should have never been granted. They are obvious. They have no merit. Now, we're going to get into the trial in much more detail later on, but I want just to paint here a picture of one of the key moments in the trial as we lead up to the launch of the XS70, the product in question here. Now, Kodak brought on their own expert witnesses to be able to talk about the technology. And here is a moment that Schwartz for Polaroid had with one of the Kodak witnesses. Now, this witness is an expert. He had been in the field for many years. He had the right credentials to be able to talk about the technology behind the SX70. And his role was to show that this technology was not that interesting. It was really not that unique. It should have never been given any kind of patent. So let me read this exchange here verbatim. Question from Shorts. Now, you have been studying and collecting cameras for at least 35 years. Is that correct? The witness answers, yes. Shorts, and you have about 2,000 cameras in your collection. Witness, yes. Shorts, and a number of prior art cameras which you have testify about come from that collection. Witness, yes. Shorts, and you also have a large collection of literature relating to cameras and camera design. Witness, I do. Shorts, and I take it that during this period of time, you tried to keep abreast of camera models as they were announced. Witness, as much as I could. Shorts, and there came a time, I take it, that you became aware of the SX70. Witness, yes. Shorts, and did you also conclude at some point in time that the SX70 performed its many functions through such wholly novel optical, mechanical, chemical, and electronic designs as to justify Polaroid's statement that it probably includes more technology than any other consumer product in the world today? Witness, I did. This moment in what is, relatively speaking, a dry trial, patent trials are not that exciting, caught the attention of the crowd, caught the attention of the newspapers. Here was the Kodak witness who's supposed to be talking about how this invention is not that novel. He's actually saying, actually, yeah, it is. In the 2,000 plus cameras I have in my collection, this is actually quite unique. This witness actually also had written an article in a newspaper at the time talking about how the SX70 might have been one of the best cameras and biggest inventions he had ever seen himself. So the Kodak trial was not going that well, and it was getting harder for them to justify. Now, the trial went on for several months. The Judge Sobel, deliberated for about 3.5 years on all the evidence, and then finally, about 9.5 years after the case was settled, after the case was filed by Polaroid, Judge Raya Sobel broke perhaps another record by finally announcing her decision in the landmark case of Polaroid versus Kodak. Now, what decision was, we'll have to wait to get to that. For now, let's actually fast forward time and let's understand Polaroid through the key person behind the company, Edwin Land. Edwin, or Land, as I think I'll use here more in this episode, shaped Polaroid in his image. The company truly reflects him as a person. So let's start by understanding who Edwin Land was and why is he just such an enigmatic individual, even 30, 40 years later. Part 2. If anything is worth doing, it's worth doing to excess. Unlike the modern tech founders, Edwin Land is a product of his time. He was born in 1909, and there are many early stories of him taking apart some kind of contraption or technology. For example, a mantle clock or a gramophone, which is really an older version of a record player or turntable today. He would take them apart, he would put them back together. His parents would get upset with him. Just some of the lore that we're going to see in Edwin Land's story. And every photo that you see of Land, and Polaroid took a lot of photos. He's always wearing a suit. In many, he's actually wearing the vest. His hair is parted to the left. There's no t-shirt or turtlenecks here. Most pictures show Land with a serious face, unless he's demonstrating his camera, in which case you might see a slight smile. Land sometimes comes across as shy and uncomfortable, but he really comes alive when he starts talking about his invention, when he starts talking about the amazing things he's trying to do with Polaroid or the technology or a specific product. Maybe his discomfort arises from the conflict between reality and the incredible world he can envision in his mind. Land had an incredible intellect. That may even be an understatement. His first invention, polarization, took place when he was 22. Now, today we see Polaroid sunglasses, and this is something that scientists had been trying to do for at least a couple hundred years. And Land came in as a teenager, young adult, and figured it out. He figured out that you could put millions of small crystals and get the light to reflect in a special way. And then he eventually found a way to commercialize this invention at an early age. He dropped out of university. He was studying at Harvard at the time, and he felt deeply that he needed to find a field in science that he could call his own, a field where he could have an impact and fulfill his expectations of himself. And polarization became that field. Now, from 22 to where we're going to be today with Polaroid, many things happened as he tried to build this company. It wasn't necessarily called Polaroid at the beginning. He will also go on to have an entire secret military career, starting in World War II and throughout most of the Cold War. This secret career has slowly become less secret as files have been declassified in recent years, and he had a significant impact, which you're going to see here in a second. Now, you can really feel the depth of his intelligence if you peer into his eyes. If you look at any photos today from Land, even in the sort of static Polaroid pictures that still remain, if you were to meet him, you may feel like you can't keep up with him intellectually, and Land would likely agree with you. Every compromise he made during the development of his products, the cameras, including the SX70, they felt like a betrayal to Land, a betrayal of the pureness of the vision that he had in his mind and that he needed to achieve. This was an admirable trait when trying to do the impossible, but there's always a price to pay for it. Now, let's go back a little bit in time to understand where this all came from. The name Polaroid to start was really a fortunate choice. This is a word that was first used about a plastic substance, celluloid, but Polaroid is related to polarization, of course, the first invention that Land did and on which he built the company. Funny enough, when they were debating names early on, one of the names that came up to the top of the list somehow is epipolypol. I can't even say it. Epipolypol. And you can imagine that would have a much difficult time today than Polaroid. But Polaroid ended up being the actual name, and that became the legal name and the name under which the company was built, and the name under which we still talk about the kind of pictures that Polaroid made famous. Now, before we get to the SX70, which is going to be released in 1972, we have to look at the time before that, at least in a brief manner. The first invention of polarization that Land did with a small team had some difficult ways of trying to commercialize it. Some of the first things they did was, for example, they created a polarized filter that you could put in front of Kodak cameras. So Kodak became one of the first customers for Polaroid, and they were buying this filter. So you can imagine this sort of big circular filter that you would put in front of a camera, and that would help with the polarization when the light came in. So Kodak would actually put in small orders for this, and then Kodak would sell them onwards. Polaroid also had sunglasses for consumers that were polarized, and this became small business. Actually, they were going to sell a few million pairs of the sunglasses, but it was never quite enough to keep the company afloat. So Land found himself before World War II with this fantastic invention. Objectively speaking, it was a fantastic, very clever, novel invention that he did with the polarization, but he really wasn't sure how to commercialize it in a way that made the company sustainable. So there were all the different attempts. One of the attempts that is worth noting here as well is actually 3D movies. So as Polaroid tried to demonstrate 3D movies, they set up two cameras at about 45-degree angle each, and they would record the scene with these two cameras, and then when they would play back, users or viewers would actually wear the special glasses that Polaroid made that would combine the two images into one and then create this sort of 3D image style for the audience. Polaroid was not the first one to invent 3D movies, but they were one of the first pioneers here and one of the companies that really made a name for themselves in 3D movies. This 3D movies have really existed since about 1915, but they had just been a niche in the motion picture industry. 3D movies will go on to have some kind of renaissance in the 50s. Polaroid would actually eventually have a lot of movies in development using their technology. But then as quickly as this renaissance came, it disappeared by the 60s which again meant from a business perspective is it was not a sustainable source of revenue for Polaroid. 3D movies beyond Polaroid would go on to have another resurgence in the 80s and 90s. They would go on to have another resurgence in the 2000s, if you remember, like the Avatar of James Cameron back in 2009. And then once again, they actually started to decrease in popularity after that resurgence in the 2000s, late 2000s. I think I saw a 3D movie a few days ago, maybe a couple weeks ago, actually, here in 2024, but they are not as popular as they used to be. So that has just been the life of 3D movies. Interesting technology, clever ways, but doesn't seem to really resonate with audiences. And of course, today movies are in a completely different spot than they were back in the 50s. So here's Polaroid. They're making a lot of noise. They are known in the industry of consumer products, but they don't really have the sort of major hit that they can build a company on, right? They are not making as much revenue as they think they should. The company is growing. They might be about 100 employees at this point in time, but they're still looking for this product. They're still looking for a way to make this polarization technology make sense for them. And to give you some numbers, in about 1953, which is after the war, and you'll see why this is relevant in a second. At the time, the company was making about $26 million in profit, driven by some of these sunglasses with polarization that they had. So it wasn't a small company, but Land felt like there was something else. There was still some kind of product that can build a large, successful company. It can really take his invention and make the most of it. Now, as we go into 1930s, into the end of the 1930s, World War II takes place. And World War II, it is huge for Polaroid. There's no way to understate it. Land and his team at Polaroid get enlisted in the war effort, and Polaroid brings their expertise and their invention, the polarization, into World War II. Now, World War II becomes a fantastic period for Land and the company for a couple reasons. One, the revenue source then becomes the government. And at the time, you can imagine there was a lot of money being spent by the US government and the Allies to be able to fight the war. So the revenue becomes consistent and it becomes quite significant. But two, perhaps more importantly for Land than just the revenue, is he gets to really do what he really loves. He's given all these different challenges by the Navy and the Army on different issues they're running into that they think Land and Polaroid might be able to help. And then he can take all his energy and work to solve those challenges. He really loved this kind of work. He really loved to figure out how to solve problems. Now, some of the things that Polaroid will go on to do are as follows. They were going to develop goggles for soldiers and pilots and so on that were polarized, so they would have a better vision. You imagine a pilot in the sky trying to minimize the polarization from the sun. So they created a lot of these goggles. And to give you a sense of how prevalent these goggles were, when the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima in 1945, its crew of several pilots and soldiers were wearing the special Polaroid adjustable goggles. Polaroid will actually go on to make goggles for dogs. The military noted that in the battlefield, sometimes the dogs retreated against orders when flying pebbles and dirt got in their eyes. So there's actually a couple pictures online you can find of a dog wearing this special Polaroid goggles that would eventually be adapted for horses and mules as well. Another use case where Land helped out was in the creation of vectography. And vectography was first used to understand the Japanese defenses on an island called Guadalcanal. Well, so as the Allies wanted to take over this island, they were unsure of what kind of defenses the Japanese had set up. They didn't have the right technology to be able to figure that out. So Land came in and they created a way to take a photo of the island from a plane or a boat, and then be able to process that photo in a way that it will reveal the different battleships and guns that had been set up in the island. So this became vectography, and it was used quite a bit by the Allies. it resulted in this sort of three-dimensional photographs. And when you view them with special Polaroid glasses, it would show the guns, the bunkers, the buildings, the airplanes, and so on. The vectography technology would then go on to be used in key battles, including Normandy, when the Allies would invade. Now, Land also had indirect influence during the war. One of the examples here was when the war started, the Japanese took over islands in Indonesia where the quinine came from. Now, quinine is known as a tree that provides the cure for malaria. At least by this point in time, it had been known for at least a few hundred years. But quinine was also used in the development of other products. Polaroid themselves actually used quinine in their production of glasses. So as the quinine source became more scarce, this became also a major priority for the Allies. So Land worked with a scientist called Woodward, last name Woodward, who would eventually develop this synthetic version of quinine. Now, Land was not directly involved in this, but the understanding is that he provided space. He provided some insights, likely helped with some of the thinking through it, and helped Woodward and his team to develop this synthetic version of quinine. Woodward would go on to actually develop to synthesize cortisone in 1951, and he would go on to receive a Nobel Prize in 1965. At the time, actually, this quinine source was so important that the Army started on this plan that they were called the Cinchona missions. They went on from about 1942 to 1945, and they were expeditions led by the U.S. to find natural sources of quinine during South America or in South America. And as Woodward, with the help of Land and his resources, figure out how to make the synthetic quinine, of course, these expeditions stopped. Now, in 1943, 2 years before the war ended, Land would go on to start to think about what's going to happen post-World War II. He knew that the money will run out, and they needed to go back again to their pre-war status, trying to figure out a product. This is when actually instant photography will start to take shape. We'll look at that in a second. His involvement with the Army, though, or with the military, did not end with World War II. After the war, he was still involved with the military and multiple presidents up to Nixon, helping them and advising them on several military matters. This work has been highly secretive. It's only been through recent times and declassification of files that we get to see more of what Land was involved with during all this time, basically from 1945 to about the 1970s. One of the significant achievements during this time after World War II can be seen in the U-2 plane. This was a reconnaissance plane that the Army needed to understand what the Soviet Union was up to after the war. It is said that Land convinced Eisenhower of the value of investing in this U-2 plane or this U-2 program by using a golf analogy. He told Eisenhower that typically a golfer might be able to see a golf ball maybe about 150 yards away, but with this photography system that will eventually become the U-2, the golf ball could be seen clearly at about 2,000 yards away. Now, the U-2 is an interesting program to look at for several reasons. When during the Cold War, as this Cold War started to ramp up, there was an opinion within the Air Force that a deep penetration of Russian airspace with impunity will take about 10 years from that point in time. This is, sometime in the late 40s, early 50s. Land felt, as many thinks, that he knew a thing or two about how to speed up the process of technological development. He partnered up with someone else in this, what would become known as sort of the Land panel of advisory for the military, this fellow called Kelly Johnson. And they came together to develop the U-2 plane, of course, much faster than simply 10 years. The first flight took place on July 4th, 1956. And from that moment, from 56 to when the plane was shut down on May 1st, 1960, when the U-2 plane was shut down over the Soviet Union, a pilot named Gary Powers was piloting the plane at the time. The U-2 really changed the course of history. right? The amount of information gained in the overflights swamped the Western intelligence community. It was said that actually the U-2 photography, the photos that were taken by the U-2 photography, were as important to intelligence of the 50s as to what code breaking had been in the 40s during the war. All of a sudden, the sort of hidden world of the Soviet Union was revealed, and it became apparent that the so-called missile gap, that there were many apprehensions at the time, was actually completely mistaken. The Soviet Union did not have the same capacity that the Americans thought they did. One of the key people involved in the plane, in the design and the flying of the plane was Martin Knudsen. And he said, quote, that it was really the highest workload airplane he had ever designed and built. You were wrestling with the airplane, you were operating all the camera systems at all the times, and you had no time to worry about whether you were over Russia or you're flying over Southern California. It was a difficult plane to fly. It was highly important to the Cold War efforts from the 50s onwards. The pilot actually had to wear this pressurized spacesuit to deliver oxygen supply, and it was estimated that a pilot typically lost about 5% of their body mass on a typical 8-hour mission. You can just imagine how difficult it was to fly the plane. Keep in mind, the Land, of course, was involved in the photography system of the plane, and not so much the actual mechanics of the plane itself. Now, what was intriguing about the U-2 is the Russians actually followed every U-2 flight on their radars, but they could not touch the planes that were flying at about 70,000 feet. And the U-2 program remained one of the best kept secrets of the Cold War, something that was kept secret by the Russians as well as the Americans, since the Soviets, they could not admit that their defenses were being breached on such a regular basis. Now, this Land panel would serve every president for decades, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and really continued to be a source of ideas on many things, including the race to space that we're going to see later on with Kennedy and Johnson, and so forth. Land would step down after he stepped down after the Watergate scandal with Nixon, and actually Nixon then labeled him an enemy of the state. And then when Nixon leaves and a new president takes over, then Land will come back and continue on. Land will have influence, and this is at least what we know from declassified files. But he would have influence on the Polaris missile launching submarine, the supersonic Blackbird intelligence airplane, the Corona spy satellite, and the miniature camera that was used on a stick used by Neil Armstrong on the Apollo 11 mission. So this is just, and again, we're going to talk about Polaroid. But what's amazing to me about Land is he has what is arguably an incredibly impressive career advising the military on all this kind of secret things from World War II onwards. And it's not something he talked about. There were rumors about it. At the time when this was going on, there were just simply rumors about what Land was doing. We know about it because of the declassification that happened later on. But keep that in mind as you hear about all the stuff that Polaroid is doing throughout the years, that as it's trying to build this company and it's achieving all the success, there's an entire work that very few people know about, especially consumers. They don't really know that this guy, Edwin Land, is also moonlighting for the government and is heavily involved in all kind of secret projects during the Cold War and onwards. And I think that just simply adds even more to the enigma of who Edwin Land is. Now let's talk a little bit about his work style, something that would become also very, in one way, part of the lore. In another way, there was a price to pay for it. Now, Land never earned a college degree. He dropped out from Harvard to go on and do that polarization work that we talked about earlier. He never went back to school. Now, during this time, it was, even when he was a young adult college dropout, it was clear that there was some interest in Land as a person. He would get job offers. In one case, he when he was just starting to build this polarization technology and figure out what to do with it, one of his partners named George Wheeler, he knew that Land was being courted by some companies to go work for them. And Land tells them, George, I told you what it's like, right? They start at 8 o'clock, they work until 4:30, then everything shuts down and goes home. They don't work on Saturdays or Sundays. They keep taking me out and introducing me to important people and telling me I should work for them. Their lab is on about 30 acres and it's what they call a small research program. And George asked him, so what are you going to do? Do you want to join this company? He's like, Land says, of course not. How could I get anything done? So even though he was being courted by companies and given job offers, he didn't want it. He felt like it didn't make sense. They weren't working long enough. They weren't working on things that were important enough. And this goes on to define Land's work style for many years. Now, everyone who worked for Land knows and has memories about the intense work days that Land would put on. The people who were very close to him, they very grew accustomed to 4 a.m. phone calls. And they were always along the lines of, I have an idea about this problem that we've been working on. Can you come in and meet me at 5? This is very common. There was a story here about one of the key people in Polaroid's early history. His name is Stan Calderwood. He ran the Polaroid marketing and sales operation for many years. And he got many of these 4 a.m. calls until one night his wife picked up the phone and just exploded at Land. So this is just what Land was accustomed. He wanted to work 12, 14, 16-hour days. He had no issues with it. He had no energy issues with it, really. He could just do it. He was just energized by tackling difficult, often seemingly impossible problems. And in many of the photos we see from Polaroid, we see them, of course, with photos, looking at things. Land is wearing a suit, a tie. He's working long days. He also had this uncanny way of making an individual an expert by telling him or her that it was his job to be the expert, that important decisions would depend on the results of his work, that the results were needed quickly. Now, his intensity of work was balanced by some good humor, some intervals of celebration to celebrate the technical and social consequences of what they were working on. But there's no denying that his level of work intensity was very, very high. Now, the engineers that eventually Land would surround himself with, which some were actually women. They were typically called as the princesses in an affectionate tone. But many of this female engineers were going to have very significant careers in Polaroid and outside Polaroid. And I'm mentioning this because we got to remember that this is the 1950s, right? Or even 1930s, 1940s, 1950s when this is happening. So this is not quite yet the time where women were completely accustomed to being in the workforce. It started in World War II, and it continued to go onward. So Land, in some ways, was also a pioneer in this manner. He wanted the best talent available. It didn't matter to him if it was male or female. Now, the engineers in the company really thought themselves as a very unique, if not elite, group. This idea of invented here, quote unquote, was very deeply ingrained in the company from the beginning. And we'll see how this may actually also play out to be part of the issues that Polaroid would face on later on. From their perspective, no one really understood the process as they did, right? How can an outsider design a machine that never existed before, even in the mind's eye, let alone on the drawing table? And an acronym of NIH, not invented here, really elicited suspicions at Polaroid. Almost as deep as they elicited in another industry over in Detroit. The car manufacturers also felt very deeply that the NIH individuals should not be allowed in the company. They should not be allowed to give in control. Now, his work style was also affected by his military work. Even though the work was primarily secret at the time, it did change his life, right? He really cultivated a circle of colleagues among the most elite realms of science and technology. And he developed long-lasting relationships with them. It influenced his behavior and lifestyle. He will go on to have 24-hour security for the entire duration of the Cold War. The William Baker, who was the president of Bell Laboratories, and he was a fellow member of the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, warned that Land was seen as an absolute prize package by the Soviets. And if they had the opportunity, they would try to kidnap him. And I mentioned this because I think some of these fears that arose from his military work also led him to be more secretive, to have a propensity for privacy. and almost like reclusiveness. So I do think if we look at Land's background, there was some shyness and this intense focus that he could give to problems, less so to perhaps social situations. And that was just simply amplified by the pressure he might have felt from his military work and what that might mean in terms of his personal safety. Now, one final thing here I'll mention on work style is, when Land wants you to do something, he sort of makes you feel like you're the greatest thing ever. And you're always going to walk away, you walk away knowing that if you fail, you're going to let him down personally, right? This is how people felt around him, even when they were being called at 4 a.m. to go tackle a problem. And for many people, the joke was, half the time you weren't quite sure what Land wanted you to do, but you had to figure it out on your own. So he created this culture, and he felt very strongly that he could make anyone into a scientist, right? If you give him enough time, he could turn them into a world-class elite scientist just by putting in the reps and by matching that intense work style that he had for his work. And this is going to be instrumental as we see the development of instant photography, which is just as an incredible technical scientific achievement that Polaroid will go on to do after World War II. Now, the final element I want to talk about Land here is him as a visionary. His role in the military advisory wasn't just because of his technical ability. That was there, but he could see things that didn't exist quite yet, right? He can envision this U-2 reconnaissance program and understand that, hey, if we build this, it's going to be a game changer for this world that we live in, this military position we find ourselves in. Now, this were America's sort of heavy days of corporate research and development, right? We have things like the RCA and CBS. We have Bell Labs, Fairchild Semiconductor, Texas Instrument working on silicon chips. Color televisions were being done. So there was a lot of development happening here. And this is 40s and 50s. We got into the 60s. In episode 2 of this podcast, I did the Boeing 747, which gets released in the 60s. So we have this crazy, amazing technological development happening in so many parts of the country. And Edwin Land and Polaroid was part of that world. He was part of that group of elite companies that were trying to work on hard, difficult problems, right? And they were releasing products at an astounding clip. Now, Land gave a talk, which you can access it today as an essay, which was titled Basic Research in the Small Company. He did this in 1946, and he laid out a dream of 1,000 small corporations, each earning about $20 million and spending about 5% of that amount on research every year. That would contribute $20 billion to the national income and employ 2 million people. Just, these are his numbers, right? This is the case that he was making for this. And he said, quote, "Year by year, our national scene will change in the way I think all Americans dream of. Each individual will be a member of a group small enough so that he or she feels a full participant in the purpose and activity of the group. His voice or her voice will be heard and his individuality recognized." This is 1946. What's amazing about this is that this is what basically Silicon Valley becomes in later years. And there's really more than 1,000 small corporations, right? 1,000 small businesses, small companies doing significant research in their specific field. Some of it might be quite not as important as others, but nonetheless, as an aggregate, they drive the GDP and the national income forward. And this is the world that Land was envisioning even in 1946. I also like when Land first started to sell this polarization technology, for example, the polarized sunglasses, he was really a great marketer. And that is, he had great vision of what it could look like. There's an example here that he brought on executives from a sunglass company, and he wanted to show them what the polarized technology looked like. So he envisioned this hotel room where as soon as the executives walked in, they would be hit by sunlight directly. So he picked up a room in the hotel where the sun was hitting it at a specific time. And as soon as the executives walked in from the sunglass company, Land would say in a pleasant voice, quote, "I apologize for the glare. I imagine you can't even see the fish." He had set up a fish bowl in front of a window. And his visitors, they would hand their briefcases and coats to George Wheelwright, and they would stare at Land blankly. They just walk into the room, right? It just spent the first 60 seconds. And Land would then hand them a pair of sunglasses with polarization and say, "Here, try the sunglasses, look through it." And as the executives look through the sunglasses with polarization, they can now see the fishbowl. And then he would ask them, quote, "How many fish do you see?" They would answer 6. And then he would say, quote, "This is where your new sunglasses will be made of. It's called Polaroid." So he had this great ability, not just to market, but to sell this vision at this micro level, and of course at this macro level with the military work, and even, of course, industry-wide, as he imagines this research world of 1,000 companies. Peter Wensberg, who would go on to lead marketing at Polaroid, he really thought that Land was a fantastic marketer, but Land didn't want to be known as a marketer, right? He wanted to be known for science and engineering and social philosophy and perhaps even writing, but not really marketing. He didn't recognize it as important. One thing to know about this confidence is that one of the key attributes of how Land made all this happen was his supreme ability, the supreme confidence that he had behind all these decisions to move ahead and to know that he could make it work and he could be infectious with the people around him, right? And as they choose problems, they would intentionally choose challenges that seemed impossible. But with Land's enthusiasm, he would then go after it. Now, final thing here I want to mention, in the 1970s, Land shot a short movie in an empty factory outside Boston. And without a script, he talked about the future of photography. And I want to read you here just a small section of that verbatim. The video, titled "The Long Walk," it will be part of the bonus content. So you can look for a link in your podcast app to look at this short video. I think it's quite worthwhile to watch it. You can see Land in action himself, and you can see him talking about this world that he's envisioning and how that world became our world. Now, let me read a small section here for you verbatim. Quote, "We are still a long way," he said, "from the camera that would be, like a telephone, something that you use all day long, a camera which you would use not on the occasion of parties only or of trips only or only when your grandchildren came to see you, but a camera that would you use as often as your pencil or your eyeglasses. It was going to be something that's always with you. You would point, shoot, see. Nothing mechanical will come between you and the image you wanted. The gesture would be as simple as here," and he demonstrated taking it into his hand pocket. He would reach into a wallet, take it out of the breast pocket. You would hold it, you would press a button, and you would take the picture. And of course, he's really talking about what smartphones became. This idea, something small enough in your pocket, you take it, you take a picture, and you go on. Keep in mind that at this point in time in the 70s, digital imaging is just starting to appear. It's not really mainstream yet. That's not going to happen until the late 90s, early 2000s. Land and Polaroid have been thinking about instant photography for about 30 years now, and they understand the value of what it means to have a photo appear instantly. But nonetheless, he's still envisioning even something further. Now, he didn't quite see all the elements, and we'll see how Polaroid, as a company, they became really stuck in the idea that a photo needed to be seen in some kind of physical format. It had to be printed. It had to be taken to paper. Today, we don't think about that. I think part of the reason why Land perhaps didn't quite see that is that computers were not yet consumer products. The Apple II will come out soon, but it's not what they became. Nonetheless, his vision of the photography field would prove to be somewhat right, at least in the most part. Now, Land will go on to shape the company through his vision, his work style, the inventions. And for now, we can now go on to see the field that Land would dedicate himself and his company and really make it his life's work. That field, the instant photography, starts in 1943. Let's dive into that. Part 3. Do not undertake a program unless the goal is manifestly important and its achievement is nearly impossible. It is 1943. World War II is raging in Europe and Asia, but the tide is turning against the Nazis and the Axis powers, especially after the 1942 Battle of Stalingrad. In May 1943, the Allies agreed to undertake a cross-channel invasion, which would become Normandy in 1944. In July 1943, Mussolini is arrested. In November 1943, the Tehran Conference takes place. This was the first time the so-called Big Three met: Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. Land and Polaroid have been helping the Allies with several war initiatives, as we saw earlier. World War II saved Polaroid financially and spiritually, as it gave Land an outlet for his genius. By 1943, however, Land knew that the war was coming to an end, at least sometime soon in the future, and the military revenues would then, of course, dry up as the war ended. Land and his family are in Santa Fe, Mexico, for a much-needed family vacation. Now, this was maybe a coincidence, but the Alamos Research Center was nearby, and the scientists, like Oppenheimer, are trying to do the impossible, to split the atom. So perhaps the warm culture of Santa Fe inspired him. Maybe there was some inspiration that came along from the Manhattan Project that was in full swing nearby where he was. But I don't think Land was really expecting the life-changing insight that would come his way. Now, Santa Fe has a very unique style to it. If we look at photos today and even photos from the past, there's this classic Pueblo Spanish revival style. And the buildings in the downtown, they have this irregular human-scale room block massing with sort of step-backs with additional stories. There's flat drains with drains by what called canales projecting through the walls. There's a battered and canted adobe or pseudo-adobe walls that really lack any kind of strict verticality. They are uneven and rounded. And this is what was surrounding Land and his family at the time. Now, as the story goes, and this story has been retold many times, and we'll take it as fact, but I'm sure there might be some exaggerations that have been added over the years. He was taking photos of his daughter, and she asked him, innocently, why can't I see the photos now? Right? At this point in time, the cameras of the time, they were not instant. Kodak had pioneered many of the camera business about 50, 60 years later. And they created this model where you would take the photo and to film, and then you would send the film to be developed. Initially, when Kodak released cameras, the very first camera that Kodak released that really made an impact in the consumer market, that took photography from just experts and put it in the hands of regular people, you would actually have to send your camera back to Kodak, and then Kodak would develop the film and send it back. By this point in time, you don't have to send a camera, but you do have to send the film somewhere. You might have to drop it off at a store, and it might take a few days, maybe up to a week to be developed. The 1 hour film development that we're going to see later on, which is going to affect Polaroid significantly, will not appear until the 70s. So Land has taken all these pictures of his daughter and family, and she wants to see them now. She doesn't want to have to wait a few days or a week to see them. Now, Land took this question, and it seemed to have struck something in him, right? And as he was walking around in that charming town with those uneven surfaces and that very classic Santa Fe style that we know, he started to try to solve the puzzle. Why couldn't she see the photos now, right? What would be needed to see the photos instantly? Now, according to Land, and again, we take this with some skepticism, but I think knowing what we know at Land, it may not be that far from the truth. Within the hour, the camera, the film, and the physical chemistry were so clear in his mind that he had this great sense of excitement. At that time, actually, just by coincidence, a fellow called Donald Brown, who was the patent attorney for Polaroid, happened to be in Santa Fe. And Land went over to Donald's hotel and started to talk about this camera that would give a picture immediately after the exposure. Now, Land and Polaroid were very diligent in making notes about when inventions took place and what was the process that got them there. They believe very strongly in patents. Land would go on to defend patents many times in his career, even before Polaroid would find itself in a patent trial with Kodak. So from the very moment, one of the first people that Land talked to, actually, even if we go back all the way to when he was 22 and he figured out polarization, one of the first people that he talked to about polarization was a patent lawyer to help them understand how to patent the process. So Land believes in patents through and through. And it so happens that his patent attorney was in Santa Fe. So as Land has this vision about the instant camera, he can go to his patent attorney and then start the documentation process that will be needed eventually to get that patent. And for him, what instant photography provided was that field that he had been seeking all his life up to this point. A field that he could make his own, a domain that he could inhabit, command, and control. It does not belong to anyone else. It's something that he can have a true impact. And that was what this field was. Now, it's hard to say if Land knew this at the moment in 1943 in Santa Fe, that this was going to be the field. But he definitely felt excited enough that this could be a potential field for him. And it was worth exploring it and put some serious resources in it. Now, the name that was given to this project was the SX70, SX-70. The naming convention related to the projects that Polaroid was working on at the time is just so happened that 70 was the next one in line from everything else that the Polaroid was doing for the military. And even before 1943 was over, it was apparent that the SX70 project was going to be a pretty fat file. In fact, it would grow to be the actual company. Now, I want to make a note here because we're going to come back to this. The camera that we're going to look at in more detail, that is really the focus of this episode, is called the SX70, but it's not this one. This camera would go on to be known as the Land camera, the model N95, the very first camera that the Polaroid released that showed the instant photography. It is a little bit more clunky. It is not as we might imagine instant photography to be today. And when Land would go back to try and figure out instant photography later on, this is now in the 60s, mid 60s and so on, and he would then release a camera in 1972, they reused the same label, the SX70. Land felt that his original vision was not fulfilled with the first camera, and it was worth it to go back, use the same project name, SX70, and then release that in 1972. So just in case you might get confused here. Going forward, we're going to use the actual name of the camera, which again was the Land camera or the Model 95. Now, this first camera, when it gets released with Polaroid, captured a lot of attention. In fact, at the time, the tagline for Kodak was, "You press the button, we do the rest." Now, at the time, it meant that if you took a photo with a Kodak camera, as Land was doing in Santa Fe, you had to press the button, then take the film out, then send the film over for development, and then the film will come back, develop with the photos. So it wasn't really quite as simple as Kodak had made it out to sound like, with his tagline. But Land and this Model 95 would actually be pretty close to that. You would press the button, and then you would get a photo, right? So they were sort of delivering on the Kodak promise a little bit more literally than Kodak itself. And it was giving the amateur the ability to do the rest, right? Kodak had taken the camera away from professionals and given them to amateurs, but amateurs still needed to rely on someone to develop photos. Now here was Polaroid giving amateurs the ability to do everything themselves and to do it in a way that was going to be very fast, right? It was going to allow amateurs to see an impulse, to take a photo and then see it right away. Now, this camera is pretty big. You can actually still find videos online, and there's going to be some videos in the bonus content showing you what this camera looked like. It's pretty cool. But it was a big camera. It weighed over 4 pounds, which was a factor of the technology itself, but also a pragmatic consideration. At the time, there was a high federal excise tax that was given to any kind of amateur camera that weighed less than 4 pounds. So Polaroid made it over 4 pounds to be exempt from this tax. How can I describe this camera? This camera is, if you imagine cameras with sort of like an accordion, it's kind of what it looks like. It is small in the sense that it may be the size of your chest, maybe. And it has a handle. And when you open it, this accordion comes out that says Polaroid and says Model 95. And the film itself that Polaroid we're going to develop goes in the back. You take the photo, there's a few steps, and in about 60 seconds, you get a photo back right away. Now, this camera was retail for $89.95 at the time, which is about $1,265 in 2024 dollars, just to give you a sense. An 8-pack of the film was put on sale for $1.75, which is about $25 today. And Polaroid really wasn't sure if anyone would actually buy this camera. It was not cheap. It was for amateurs, but not so cheap that anyone could afford it. So one of the first things that Polaroid did when they were ready to demonstrate it is they set up a demonstration platform and a sign that read, "May we take your photograph with the new Polaroid Land camera." And as a crowd gathered in this, it was a photography store, the interest or the doubt in the interest was really short-lived. The crowd quickly bought up everything that they brought. They had about 50 cameras that they brought with them, and all of those sold out right away. So again, there's a few videos showing you how the camera works. This Model 95, the science itself is very impressive. If you imagine a dark room today where you take the photo, you put it on film, you develop it, you get the negative, you have to put some kind of chemical bath to get the photo to appear. Polaroid and Land had to figure out how to do all of that in this 4-pound small device, and to do it in about 60 seconds. So Polaroid, we're going to spend 5-10 years trying to figure out this science of how you make a photo appear instantly. Now, the first photos were not high quality. They were really more in a sepia tone, and you might be familiar with the sepia tones if you use Instagram or any kind of app like that. This is what the initial photos will look like. Eventually, Polaroid would figure out how to do the black and white, which required even more scientific breakthroughs. And then eventually, they will eventually do colors, which again require even more breakthroughs. But Land had to figure out how do you when you have this pack of film and you click the shutter, how do you take the film to be rolled through the small camera, and as it rolls, you're going to apply the chemical bath that you figure out. And as the camera keeps rolling, the chemicals are applied, then they have to be somehow dried. Then the photo comes out, this film comes out, and then it might take another 60 seconds for it to fully develop. So very, very impressive scientific achievements. And one of the first places where Land actually demonstrated this camera was in an optical society, which is more of a scientific gathering. And it was just, even to the colleagues in the space, it was just very, very impressive to see a camera take a photo and then see the result of that camera within a couple minutes. This was just something that had never really been seen before. It was a complete breakthrough in the industry. And again, this is the Model 95. It started with the 1943 vision, and it would eventually be realized by Polaroid and become the primary product on which the company would get built. Now, in the interim, from this 1943 vision to when the camera gets released, Polaroid struggled financially as once again those military revenues dried up. But if you look at some of the numbers, the Polaroid sales they went from about 1.5 million in 1948 to 9.3 in 1951 when the camera is released. By 1957, Polaroid sales would reach a level of $48 million. That's about $550 million in today's dollars. And by 1959, they would reach about 90 million, which is just over $1 billion in 2024. The Polaroid stock would split several times during this period, multiplying in value 7 times from 1954 to 1958 alone. So Land, all of a sudden, was quite wealthy, and many of his team members, especially the early team members, were also quite wealthy, right? In 1950, Polaroid had about 429 employees. That number would blossom to 2,873 over the next 10 years. And on September 27, 1956, the 1 millionth Land camera, the Model 95A, came off the assembly line, and it was sold at a New Year's Eve at a Village camera shop in South Orange, New Jersey. So look at this, right? This is quite incredible, right? So the sales are about 1.5 million in 1948. By that point, it had been a few years after World War II. The revenue had dried up as expected. Polaroid had to do layoffs. They had to reduce their staff. And by 1951, about 7 years later, from the vision and when Polaroid started to work on this camera, sales are going up. And of course, by 1959, we're now about 17 years from that 1943 Santa Fe vision. Polaroid as a company is growing very quickly. So this had proven to be a huge hit for Polaroid. This Land camera, this Model 95A, was just a huge success. And it really established Polaroid as a company to watch, right? It's sometimes been said that Polaroid is the Apple of their day, though it might actually be more accurate to say that Apple is the Polaroid of today. Now, at this point in time, it's helpful to compare to Kodak because Kodak is going to loom large in the story. But Polaroid was still just a fraction of Kodak, right? Kodak was the unchallenged dominant force in the worldwide photography industry. In 1956, Polaroid had net profits of about $3.6 million on sales of $34 million. In contrast, Kodak boasted record earnings of $94 million on sales of $762 million. So Kodak was about 20 to 30 times the size of Polaroid, and there was really no challenge to Kodak. So Polaroid had established and created this market, really, this instant photography market. Kodak had no equivalent camera in the space that could do the instant photography. They simply did not have the technology that Polaroid and Land had invented. But Kodak had everything else, right? All the other cameras that were not instant, all the film, all the accessories, and so on. So Kodak is just this huge, huge company. And in fact, they work very closely with Polaroid at the time. Polaroid was not doing things themselves. So at this point in time, Polaroid still believed in partnering with other companies. So when it came time to do film, for example, they work with Kodak. So Kodak would develop the film, and then they would sell it. They would work with other manufacturers for lenses and the camera itself. So Kodak would go on to benefit from the instant photography boom because they would help with the film itself. So just to give you a sense of what this relationship with Kodak is looking like. If you remember all the way back when Land was 22, one of his first early customers for the polarization invention was Kodak. At the time, right, Polaroid created this polarized lens that Kodak was selling. And that relationship continued even to this day. And of course, as Polaroid establishes themselves in this instant photography market, Kodak is along for the ride. Now, I want to make a few notes here about this Land camera here, just to demonstrate how Land believed a company should be run and how he saw the company evolving. In the late 1940s, he brought on a scientist named Howard Rogers. He's important because Howard would go on to patent several things for Polaroid, and some of those patents are going to play a big role in the Kodak trial that we're going to see later on. Now, when Land brought on Howard Rogers, he told them that he needed to figure out how to produce color instant pictures. At the time, right, it started with sepia pictures, then they moved on to black and white, and Howard now needed to figure out color. Now, for 2 solid years, Rogers just watched and considered. Then one day he came to Land and said, "I'm ready to start." Now, Land told the story to an audience to demonstrate that Polaroid was the kind of company where a man or a woman was expected to sit and think for 2 years. Not allowed to, but expected. And Land was very proud of this, right? Because he thought that a company like Polaroid and other companies, they should be working on really tough, almost impossible problems. And if you're working on those kind of problems, you're not really just acting and doing. You need to be thinking deeply. And Howard was given the leeway to sit and think for 2 years about how to make this color instant pictures. And when he was ready, then the company can start to go through the actual research, right? So just a huge, specific culture that Land was building, right? And in fact, I mean, if you look at the Land camera, it was about 7-8 years of development before the company before the product was released. And from Land's perspective, this was completely normal to spend 7, 8, 10 years. We're going to see this again and again, trying to develop product and then release it with very minimal market research and so on. This is just the way that companies are built. This is the way the Land believed that true groundbreaking work is done. Now, the chemistry of color film was quite sophisticated, especially compared to black and white. It took about 16 years to develop the color instant pictures. 2 years while Howard sat and thought about it. 8 years of molecular construction and reconstruction in the color laboratory, and 6 years of intensive work with Kodak's assistance, again, right, to prepare the prototype for production. So just look at these timelines, right? 16 years to figure out the color instant photography portion. It had taken maybe another 5-6 years to get the initial camera, maybe another 5-6 years to figure out the black and white, and now the color photos come in. These are just the things and the timelines that Polaroid is working on, and it comes all the way from the top, right? Land himself is working on this. He's taking part in that the molecular construction and reconstruction. He's part of the intensive work that took place to figure out the color instant photos. Fun fact, Howard Rogers would go on to propose and test about 5,000 compounds over that time to figure out the perfect instant color film. Now we're leading up to the core product here, the SX70 from 1972. All of this is background that we need to understand Polaroid and Land by the time we get there. In 1968, Polaroid was in the midst of a decade that would see its sales grow from about 129 million in the year Polocolor, this is the instant color pictures, was released, to about 571 million. The growth came not just from Polocolor, from the color instant photos, but Polaroid also introduced a camera called the Swinger. There's actually an ad in the bonus content for the Swinger. You might remember, has a little catchy jingle. The local Swinger was also Polaroid's way of really appealing to teenagers and younger people. They introduced the Swinger in 1965, and it retailed at about $14. And it was really one of the first attempts by Polaroid to go after Kodak's mass market domain, right? The Land camera was really not a mass market play, even though it drove significant revenue for Polaroid and it attracted a lot of attention. Very similar in the way the first iPhone was released. And even though the first iPhone was more expensive than other phones, it attracted a lot of people to it. But the Swinger started to get Polaroid much more in Kodak's world. It's still within the instant photography realm, but nonetheless, just so we start to see that the relationship that Kodak and Polaroid have will start to deteriorate as we get into the 70s and we get into the release of the SX70. Now, Kodak, besides the production of the film, they were very close collaborators with Polaroid. That is, the scientists at Kodak were working with Polaroid scientists to figure out the color instant film and the black and white and so on. And as this relationship breaks apart, we're going to see a lot of tension and resentment grow out from that period. Now, about 7 million Swingers were sold in the first 3 years, driving Polaroid's sales and profits to new heights, right? And starting to attract some doubts from Kodak and their team. Now, from the professional photographers, which Polaroid brought on to their company, at least some of them, right? For example, there was a photographer called Ansel Adams. He became a consultant for Polaroid and really tested a lot of the Polaroid cameras. In the professional world, many felt that black and white was really a more honest reflection of photograph. And even the more open-minded photographers felt that the color stuff really wasn't appropriate. And this went on all the way to the 70s. But again, even though this was the photography perception, from the amateur market perspective, the color was a huge hit, right? And being able to take color photograph was a huge boom to Polaroid as a whole. So now let's move on to what we came here for this episode. The release of the SX70 in 1972. By this time, Polaroid is an established company. They have a growing revenue and profits, and Land is ready to fulfill the initial vision from 1943. Part 4. If you are able to state a problem, then the problem can be solved. The rest is just hard work. 1972. Richard Nixon will defeat George McGovern in a landslide victory to become president. Early in the year, tapes had been set inside the Watergate complex, setting off a series of events that will culminate with Nixon stepping down in 1974. The anti-war movement is growing against Vietnam. The end of the war is a year away, and in over a decade of fighting, some 58,000 U.S. troops have been killed. Vietnamese casualties include more than 200,000 South Vietnamese troops and more than 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong irregulars. Civilian deaths total as many as 2 million. As we go into this year, Land felt, as we saw before, that even though the 95A camera had been a huge success, it was also what some people might call a compromise, and what I think Land may have seen as a betrayal of his 1943 Santa Fe vision. It was not a true one-step instant photography. He felt that there were all these extra steps that you had to do to come up with a photo. You had to not just load the film, but you had to take a specific tab and then pull it and this and that. There were at least 3 or 4 extra steps that he felt should not be there in the instant camera that he envisioned. So he went back to the drawing board, him, Howard, and all the key Polaroid people, to develop what would become the SX70. They took back the same file name that they started back in 1943 and used it for the new camera that Polaroid would go on to demonstrate in 1972. Now, Polaroid and Land like to demonstrate new products at the annual shareholders meeting every year. The format that actually Land follow here would go on to be imitated by people like Steve Jobs. So if you've seen Jobs do the product releases, that format and style really came from Land. And Jobs, as we know, loved Land. He actually met Land at least several times, and he really thought the way he and Polaroid were run were a huge source of inspiration for Apple. So in the 1972 annual shareholders meeting, Polaroid set up this huge warehouse that they converted into a launch pad for the new Polaroid SX70 camera. Now, 6 years earlier to 1972, so that will put us in 1964, Land had made this daring gamble of committing more than $500 million of Polaroid's laboratory research funds in the pursuit of the ultimate instant photography system. He didn't do any market research to determine if people would buy it, just like before, just like when Polaroid dove into the Land camera, the 95A, there was no market research, and he would be quoted as saying that Polaroid doesn't do market surveys. We create markets with our products, something that Jobs will also go on to say later on. And this leap of faith that Land took in 1966, actually, would be perhaps one of the biggest gambles ever made on a consumer product. Now, Land, again, was heavily involved in the research process of this true instant photography system. Polaroid got a chance to rethink all those initial assumptions of what this camera could look like, the size of it, the photos, the format, what the actual chemical process looks like. There's a great point here that I came across in my research where they needed to figure out the viewfinder of what this camera would be, and the scientists were having an issue with it. And Land told the key scientist for this division that he said, forget it. You guys keep your head down on the camera. I'll invent the viewfinder. And then so Land goes, and then he goes and invents the viewfinder that would become the one that's used in the SX70, which is a viewfinder that uses a reflection of light. So even though the the viewfinder is lower than where you look at the camera. The use of mirrors reflects lights in a way that you're viewing through the same viewfinder. Now, the camera is a sort of true miracle of modern engineering, right? There's about 300 transistors that control a myriad of fully mechanized and automated functions of the camera. Folded, the camera measure 7 inches in length, 4 inches in width, and just slightly more than 1 inch high. The camera actually fits into a pocket of a man's shirt. It might be a little tight, but it does fit. And if you see it today, actually, it would fit in the back pocket of a jean. A little bit of the camera would stick out from your back pocket, but you could carry it in your back pocket nonetheless. And for Land, he declared proudly that this was really the dreams and efforts of hundreds of people and dozens of teams who had come together to build this incredible revolutionary product. And to him, it was really a fulfillment of that 1943 Santa Fe vision. Now, people, we know, understood that Land had a high level of intensity about his work, but they were really quite fulfilled, right? Here's a quote from one of the engineers at the time where he says that the experience of working with Edwin Land was the best I ever expected in my professional career. He expressed an uncompromising technical need, bordering on a kind of fantasy, in an enormously expensive and valuable development program. We were able to bring together a superb collection of diversely and incredibly skilled people who were able to support each other's concepts with complementary skills and were given the chance to be successful. For most of us involved, the fine line between impossible and very difficult was moved a little bit. So this is going to become a huge success for Polaroid. Not right away, as we'll see in a second, but at least from a technical perspective, it is just a home run. Now, Land, would predict that the public is going to find the camera irresistible. You just can't stop using it once you start. And, jokingly, he added that, quote, "We may plan to ask the government for government subsidies as this addiction is preferable to heroin." And Land predicted that he believed that this camera, the SX70, would be as widely used as the telephone. And he may have been actually right about that. This camera would go on to be used a lot. Now, there's a short movie that was made for the release of the camera. It's a short film by two individuals called Charles Eames and Ray Eames. And it shows the camera and how it functioned. So when you open it up, how the light came in through the bottom part of the camera, and then you can see it in the viewfinder in a single lens reflex. It showed the chemicals of how the film was taken and then processed, and then it was spit out. And the product this camera spits out is very much the classic Polaroid format that you may have seen, right? With the white borders, it's a bit of a rectangle. So I do highly recommend you watch this film. It's again in the bonus content. It's about 10 minutes, and it really captures the use of the camera so well. And it shows the product in action by, just average people, families, moms, dads, and so on. So if you have 5-10 minutes, you can get a great look at how this product works. Now, Land shows this camera for the first time in 1972 at the annual shareholders meeting. It was a little early. The Polaroid team felt that Land was being premature to showing this product. There would be some production delays with the camera. So once again, in 1973, Polaroid would set up another demonstration of the camera, and now the camera would actually go on sale. And even when they release the camera, they cannot fulfill the demand that's coming for this product. The demand for this is just huge, and Polaroid just does not have the capacity. By this point in time, Polaroid also started to make a difference philosophically on how they produce products. They started to bring things in-house. So they were going to produce the film and the battery. Funny enough, each film pack actually contains a battery. So when you put the film pack into the camera, it provides battery for the camera. The lens, the camera itself, everything will get produced in-house. This will cause other issues with Kodak as Polaroid moves away from that. But it also will cause issues for Polaroid itself as it took ownership of so many things. Part of the reason why Polaroid did this is they were not happy with the quality they were getting from contractors, from third-party partners, and they wanted to control it. So Polaroid has taken on all this overhead to make this camera work, to deliver this vision. And in a way, the product is working, right? The demand for it is just huge, right? And customers love it. And as a product, it's just so beautiful. Just, it takes about 10 photos per film. It spits them out right away. It takes maybe a few minutes for the photo to fully develop, for fully to appear. But it was just one of those products that just so intuitive in the way it was developed and released, and customers loved it. Now, one of the things that I wanted to know here is during one of the annual shareholders meetings, the Polaroid team prepared shareholders reports and they printed these reports. Now, there were about 4,000 people in attendance, but about 10 times as many were printed. So about 40,000 annual reports were printed. And in the front of each annual report, there was a picture of a rose, a print of a rose that was taken with an SX70. So you can imagine that the Polaroid team took 40,000 individual photos of the same rose, and same rose, or perhaps maybe multiple roses, and then they put them on top of each annual report. You may actually see photos of this online of what this rose looked like. Nonetheless, right, this is just the level of quality and detail the Polaroid is thinking about when they release this camera, when they think about this SX70 and the impact the camera can have on the company and on society. Now, the camera's released. There's way too much demand for Polaroid to handle, but they are slowly fixing that. They're slowly adding more manufacturing capacity. They're slowly adding more product on the shelves. But let's look at in more detail what was the results from the SX70 release on the company, on Edwin Land, and broadly to society. Part 5. The only thing that keeps us alive is our brilliance. The only thing protecting our brilliance is our patents. Now, the camera was first shown in 1972 at the annual shareholders meeting. And in 1973, Land reluctantly admitted that the current pace of manufacturing was a little too slow, and there was issues with the full national distribution of the SX70. So they had started to just release it in smaller cities and smaller states. They were still working towards it, and eventually Polaroid would figure it out. But again, with his sort of characteristic optimism, Land's attitude was, what is 6 months delay in the course of a revolution? And you gotta keep in mind that this annual shareholders meetings were not really what you might expect from the time. During this era of the 70s and 80s, these shareholder meetings tended to be secretive. They were held in remote places. There was high security. Corporations were really wary of people trying to come into the shareholder meeting and trying to ask questions of executives that would embarrass them and put them on the spot. The shareholders meetings for Polaroid were completely not that. They were just huge fan events, right? The shareholders were huge lovers and supporters of Land and Polaroid, and the atmosphere here was not confrontational. It was really a huge group of people that believed Land was incredible and Polaroid was such an amazing company. So hugely optimistic. And in a way, it's kind of similar to, I think, what we might see with the Apple events today. It's generally a group of people who are strong Apple supporters. You're not coming in and facing the wolves, so to speak. Now, consumers obviously loved the SX70, but Wall Street did not. So as this camera was released in 1972, Wall Street, and Polaroid is a public company, of course, they really believed that Land had blown through too much money to release to release this product, and they were very negative on the Polaroid stock as a whole, as an investment vehicle. From the early 1960s to 72, the company's share price had more than quadrupled. And as the SX70 was introduced, it spiked again to a high of 149.50. But then the reports started to come in. There were battery problems, there were camera shortages, there was flawed film. Bill McCune, who would go on to replace Land as the president and was part of the very small management team of Polaroid at the time, he would go on to reveal that 300,000 cameras came back for repairs and alterations. Dealers would claim that one film pack out of 10 had a bad battery, right? If you remember, every film pack contained this really tiny, thin layer that was a battery itself. And broadly, the economy was going through the oil shock of the 70s, which was affecting all stocks, even the strong ones. So by July 1974, the Polaroid share price had dropped more than 90%. And some analysts in Wall Street were calling the SX70 the Edsel of the 1970s. Now, this is not going to be true, but keep this in mind that this is what the first few years of the SX70 was looking like. A lot of demand by consumers, a lot of problems on the manufacturing part, especially, right? We know that Polaroid took over a lot of this manufacturing element. So in many cases, Polaroid had to build entire manufacturing facilities just to be able to get this product out. And financially, the company was not seen as positive by Wall Street. For the first time, people started to grumble that perhaps Land had too much of an ego, right? That his ego had got him the better of him and that his overspending was irresponsible. Now, Land, for his part, actually blamed the marketing department, insisting that people simply had to be educated about how to focus on SLR, the single lens reflex that the SX70 had. And he believed, even by 1975, he believed that the company was simply not spending enough money to promote the camera. Now, as this is going on, Kodak saw the camera before in 1972. They saw it maybe a year earlier. And we know that relationship had started to deteriorate even in the late 60s when Polaroid introduced the Swinger camera. So Polaroid is still a major customer for Kodak. They were still buying a lot of film for, imagine, any other camera besides the SX70. Polaroid knew that this older cameras will eventually become obsolete as the SX70 became more popular, and future models would likely use the film that the Polaroid developed. So Kodak decided to go into the instant camera business. So Kodak had an event, this sort of lavish presentation at the Posh Hotel Pier, and they announced two camera models: a lower price EK4, which was listed at $53, and an automated EK6, which was $69. And the EK6 included a motor to eject the film unit after exposure. Now, both cameras were obviously aimed at the same market as Polaroid's Pronto camera, which is released after, but they were just really going into the instant camera business as a whole. And Kodak announced that they had a more sophisticated folded model, which was aimed at the SX70 directly, and that would be introduced a year later. Now, this is important because we're going to see the trial here in a little detail. So Kodak, after a few years, decided, you know what? We are going to go into this instant camera field. Kodak was unsure about if they could from a patent perspective, but they decided to push ahead nonetheless. They thought, you know what? Whatever happens with the patents, we'll deal with it. And we are going to go into the instant camera business. Now, slowly, with pressure from all sides, eventually the ship righted itself at Polaroid. And by 1975, it was really picking up speed. The batteries were worked out. There were enough cameras. Any other issues were worked out as well. And within a couple of years, by about 1977, Polaroid reaches $1 billion in annual sales. It turns out that the SX70 was actually no Edsel whatsoever. It was really more like the Ford Mustang. It would be a product that would really go on to change the business and even photography as a whole. And eventually, major photographers like Andy Warhol would give up their cameras for this one and use it much more frequently. For Polaroid, though, the SX70 launch would go on to be really part of the peak for the company. If we look at revenue, we'll start to see increases in revenue, but then a peak in innovation and new ideas. So this moment in time is unique, and we'll see where Land lands after. We're going to see the company struggle in the next few years. But nonetheless, if we were to look at the strategy of the SX70, in a way, it worked. It was a big gamble. It had the first couple years that were quite rough for the company and for the stock. But by 1975 and late 70s, the company is doing well. The company is really benefiting from the success of the strategy. And the approach the Land took at the end gets validated, gets redeemed. But the company will struggle after that. Now, we're going to see more about the demise of Polaroid in the next section. But for now, I want to jump into the trial itself, because this is going to be the big topic for the 70s. And the SX70 was really one of the big factors that contributed to this trial taking place. Now, let's look at some of the things that led up to this moment in the 70s. Now, we saw that Polaroid and Kodak had worked very closely with each other for many years now. And when they were developing, when Polaroid was spending 16 years trying to develop instant color film, they were working with Kodak very closely to make this happen, as Kodak was going to be the one to manufacture this film at the end. So many of the individuals who had worked with Polaroid on Kodak's side, they knew how much effort had been put by both companies, and especially by Kodak, and they felt a little snubbed. One of the things that happened is it seems like Land was really unable to give enough credit to Kodak publicly. And this has been going on for years. He had never really spoken too much about what Kodak had done for Polaroid in terms of helping them to release the very initial cameras, the 95A and the Swinger and so on. And this kind of started to create resentment within the Kodak team towards Land and Polaroid. Again, this is building out over years, but it would eventually become part of the issue. Now, Land and Polaroid were a valuable customer to Polaroid, to Kodak. They brought in about $50 million a year in sales to Kodak through the films. So they were financially showing support for Kodak, but publicly less so. As we go into the 60s, mid 60s, late 60s, and especially the 70s, the team at Kodak changed, right? And one of the new incoming CEOs was really quite antagonistic to Land from day one. This executive was called Louis Ehlers. He was the son of an Illinois grocer who had joined Kodak in 1934 after earning a doctorate in chemistry at the Northwestern University. He was appointed Kodak's president in 1967 and would then add the title of CEO in 1969, both on January 1st. Now, Ehlers took the reins during this unprecedented period of success at Kodak. The company had enjoyed 12 consecutive years of higher sales and 14 straight years of higher profits. Its per-share earnings had climbed from $1.32 to $4.37. So to Ehlers, being able to maintain this growth was a challenge, but something that he could do. He would famously call Polaroid and he would ask for Mr. Land, which was sort of this blatant disparagement of the honorary degrees that Land had. Land, even though he never finished college, would go on to receive several honorary degrees, including one from Harvard. So for many people, he was referred to as Dr. Land, but Ehlers seemed to relish not using the doctor label for Land. Now, one of the first things that drove fear and concern at Kodak was the release of the SX70. Land has spoken about this camera to Kodak executives before the 1972 release or the 1972 showcase at the annual shareholders meeting, but many Kodak executives saw it for the first time at that 1972 meeting. Now, by this point in time, Kodak had already decided to go ahead and release some kind of instant photography system. They had a program that was titled the P130 program, and they were really anxious to see what Land and Polaroid were releasing in 72. And they prepared a very detailed report, and they realized that the entire program had to be scrapped, and they had to start from scratch to be able to compete with something like the XX70. They felt like the size, the white border, the black backend of the film unit, and even the time and development of the process, which is quite innovative. Whatever they were developing in the P130, they could not compete with something like the SX70. It's helpful to know a little bit about Kodak here. They're not the focus of this podcast, but some background will be helpful. Kodak was modeled after its, quote, exceedingly straight-laced bachelor founder, George Eastman. During the period where George Eastman was in charge, and even after, even when we go into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the Kodak executives were prohibited from including alcoholic beverages on their expense reports. And if a secretary was asked to stay past 5 p.m., a chaperone had to be called in. Kodak is based out of Rochester, and they were really the predominant economic force in the small town. By the early 1970s, about 1 out of every 6 members of the Rochester community was on its payroll. The community had about a couple hundred thousand individuals. And in the Rochester world, there was really little the company could do wrong, right? Kodak was the king of its domain. It treated employees well. It gave lots of sort of liberal fringe benefits. It was able to maintain unions away even during this period. And to a lot of smaller companies, if you imagine the photography stores, the processing stores, and anyone else, they were really seen as the sort of the, quote, great yellow father. And of course, as we know, Kodak was the unchallenged, dominant company in the photography space worldwide, right? Gotta remember, even though Polaroid is doing really well with instant photography, even though they're eventually going to drive $1 billion in sales for their instant cameras, the Kodak was everything else. That's not instant photography. So this kind of created an environment of ego, a certain bravado that the Kodak executives felt, of infallibility. Fortune, the magazine, once characterized this perspective from which sort of Kodak operated as the, quote, a lofty pinnacle above the fray. So this is Kodak, right? So for so long, they had been unchallenged, and now they're starting to feel some fear from this instant camera that Land and Polaroid have developed called the SX70. There's resentment within the company from the snubbing that the Kodak felt from Land over many years before. Also keeping in mind that by this point in time, late 60s, early 70s, many of the people who were really instrumental, who had worked, for example, with Howard Rogers very closely, were no longer in the company, right? So some of the incoming chief executives and executives in general, they were just seeing a company that seemed kind of snobbish, that seemed to be releasing a product that could be a significant threat to their business. And they don't really have a strong connection to Polaroid team sort of working with them side by side. So internally, Kodak was reporting that the new system, the SX70, will have some kind of tremendous negative impact on the growth of Kodak's film business whenever it's introduced. Polaroid, of course, has its own film system at this point in time, and Kodak is going to miss out on those sales. And they felt that the decrease in roll film could be up to 817 million units over a 10-year period, resulting in a sales loss in excess of $6 billion. And the memo acknowledged internally that despite Kodak spending more than a decade to find an alternative to Polaroid's one-step technology, there was really no basis to say that Kodak could design an operating system of its own at all without licenses from Polaroid. So the patents that Polaroid had so diligently seeked out were an issue for Kodak, right? Kodak had put in significant resources trying to figure out this one-step instant photography system. Kodak, like Polaroid, had a heavy research department. In that same research department, actually, Kodak would also develop some of the seeds of digital imaging. They were not the first company to do it, but they were playing around with digital technology, just like they were playing around with instant photography. So despite many years of it, they just did not see a way forward. And the patents themselves meant that they were likely going to infringe on those patents if they proceeded in any way. Now, the committee that was in charge of this instant photography project at Kodak provided a directive, one that would become relevant in the trial itself, that told its scientists, quote, not to be constrained by what an individual feels is a potential patent infringement. Now, the memo then goes on to tell researchers that they should consult the patent department just to be sure. But nonetheless, this excerpted sentence would then get brought up in the trial multiple times as Kodak blatantly decided to infringe on patents that they knew they had no way around, right? So keep this in mind as we see how the trial plays out. Now, Kodak was no stranger to patents themselves, right? More than 60 years before Edwin Land applied for his first patent, this is back when Land is 22, George Eastman applied in the United States and Europe for patents of his own path-breaking photography inventions, ultimately erecting an intellectual property fortress as impregnable as Polaroids. In fact, as of 1975, Kodak had over 6,000 unexpired patents, all of it which Kodak considered valid, and all of it which it expected others to respect. So Kodak was not naive to the role of patents. They had seeked them out too. They knew what the value of patents were, and they knew what Polaroid had. Despite it, Kodak felt so threatened by the instant camera, and they felt that it was a worthwhile gamble to go into this field and possibly infringe on the Polaroid patents. Now, another point here in the Kodak-Polaroid relationship was brought to my attention by Steve Blank, who was looking at some recently declassified files on Land during his military career, right? If you remember, while all of this is going on, Land is actually actively working with the military on many projects for the military. One of them was a satellite that was taking photos of the Soviet Union and any other regions. And this satellite was operated by the CIA. Eventually, it goes on to an organization called the NRO. And the military organizations and intelligence organizations would turn to one person for expertise on the imaging reconnaissance questions, and that person was Edwin Land. By the mid-1970s, these photo reconnaissance satellites, they could see objects as small as a few inches from space. And at that point in time, the latest satellite, called the Hexagon, was the size of a school bus and had 6 of sort of this special re-entry vehicles that would send the film back to Earth. So the satellite, the Hexagon, was using actual film to take photos and then send those photos in film format back to Earth, where they would get developed and then they would get analyzed by the intelligence agencies. This was state of the art at the time, but it did have one drawback. The pictures they returned, they might be days, weeks, or even months old. This meant that in a crisis, for example, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, or the Arab-Israeli war in 1973, the photo reconnaissance satellites could not provide timely warnings or indications. It was a little too delayed. The holy grail at the time was to be able to send pictures in real time. Now, over the next 2 years, Land would lobby within this political world, and he would convince Nixon to build a new type of satellite that would use electronic imaging, effectively moving away from the film-based satellites. And guess who produced the film for the satellites? Kodak. Now, in the 1970 annual report that Kodak put out, they stated, quote, that government sales dropped from $240 million in 1969 to $160 million in 1970, a decline of about 36%. That's about $750 million in today's dollars. Now, Kodak also had about 1,400 people in a special facility that developed the film for the satellites. The facility was codenamed Bridgehead. And when the film was removed from the satellites, when they were replaced by electronic imaging, about 1,000 people were let go from Kodak. Now, 1976 was really the sort of landmark year for both Kodak and Polaroid. This is when the patent trial would start, when Polaroid would sue Kodak for patent infringement, but it was also when that first digital imaging satellite would go into orbit. So we want to keep this in mind, right? There's all these factors that are affecting the Kodak-Polaroid relationship that had been in existence for many years, all the way from when Land was 22, 23. And some of it is happening publicly with Polaroid releasing the SX70, and some of it is happening behind the scenes with Kodak losing its film business from the government and rightly or wrongly attributing this loss to Edwin Land, who was arguing against the use of film in satellites. Now, we can't say with 100% certainty that Kodak decided to infringe on the Polaroid patents because of one single thing. It was likely multiple elements, multiple things that drove Kodak to say, you know what, we are going to release cameras, which would become the EK4 and EK6 we mentioned earlier, and whatever happens with the patents, we'll figure it out. Now, there are primarily two legal defenses to a charge of patent infringement. First, the accused infringer, Kodak in this case, can argue that the invention disclosed and described in the patent is not used in its product. So they could say that this specific patent is actually not being used in the SX70. This is known as what was described in the patent itself is not being used in the EK4 or EK6 by Kodak. This is known as non-infringement. Second, the alleged infringer, Kodak, can argue that the patent being asserted is invalid because the U.S. Patent Office should have never issued it in the first place. In this case, the patent is not enforceable. Now, invalidity, which would be one of the key ways that Kodak is going to pursue, the key strategy Kodak is going to pursue in the trial, can be established for several reasons. The most common one is just a lack of invention. That is, the patent itself can only be granted if the inventor discloses something new in the application. That is something that hasn't been disclosed in earlier patents that is novel, which would be the legal term here. So someone like Kodak can argue that this specific patent, or a group of patents in this case, should have never been issued, and they should have never been issued because the things that are covered in the patent themselves are not novel. They were common sense, or they were obvious to any person reasonably skilled in the technology at the time. Now, as Kodak releases this cameras in the EK4, EK6, Polaroid decides right away to sue Kodak for patent infringement, starting this 15-year process that we're gonna see here play out. In one of the shareholder meetings, either in 1976 or 1977, Land put on what was described as a virtuoso performance, talking about this patent trial that Polaroid was undertaken to the shareholders. And he felt that the company was in a desperate position, right? And this is where Land famously said, quote, "The only thing that's keeping us alive is our brilliance. The only way to protect our brilliance is patents. This is a very soul we're involved in our whole life. For them, it's just another field." Land here is actually paraphrasing Lord Byron's observation that for a man, love is a thing apart, but for a woman, love is her whole existence. To which Land exclaimed, "To the rest of the photography industry, photography is a thing apart. To Polaroid, it is the whole life." So he's trying to rally shareholders, try to rally the company to say, hey, this is an existential crisis we're facing with this patent trial with Kodak, and Kodak trying to not only infringe on the patents, but really going into the market itself. To Land and Polaroid, their biggest fear was that if the patents do not protect Polaroid, then Kodak is just going to consume Polaroid, right? They are way bigger. They have more resources. They're going to undercut Polaroid, and Polaroid as a company will disappear. That's really the fear that Polaroid has. And they believe that the only thing keeping Kodak at bay are the patents. And this is, a classic sort of David versus Goliath battle. Here's Polaroid, a small company, successful company, but a small company. And here's Goliath, Kodak, with all the resources in the world, trying to encroach in Polaroid's only industry, right? While Kodak has multiple things, multiple industries, Polaroid only has one, instant photography. At the time, it was estimated that Kodak controlled 90% of the conventional amateur film market and 85% of the consumer camera market. It was a huge mismatch in resources. And for Land, I think this became a defense of his entire life's work. This was really a defense of everything he believed in. The patent system, his patents, all the inventions he had made. So, even though Land is getting older at this time, he's going to retire soon from Polaroid, in some cases by force. This patent trial is going to become a huge stake in the ground for him for everything that he has worked up to this point. At least the things he has worked on publicly, right? He has his entire work that is secret, that is not well known at the time. So for him, his entire public work is being challenged by Kodak in this patent trial. Now, the trial itself is lengthy. There's a great book in the show notes by Ron Fierstein, who I got to speak with actually for a few minutes. It was fantastic. And he goes into a lot of detail about the trial itself. I highly recommend you check out the book. The book is fascinating. Even though it's very heavy on legal details, it's a great story, well told. The trial will take about 5 years of discovery before it even gets started. And discovery, it just means all the documents are being shared. Key witnesses are being deposed. So Land gets deposed. Howard Rogers gets deposed. The Kodak CEO. This happens over 5 years. It is very lengthy, very detailed, very time-consuming. Land throws himself into this process with his typical energy and excitement, and he just does a fantastic job. After 5 years of discovery, and something to know here is that Kodak, it really seems like the Kodak strategy was to go for a settlement. You know, they felt that if they could really extend the discovery, they would continue to put pressure on Polaroid and their limited resources, and then Polaroid would settle. What Kodak wanted was access to the patents from Polaroid. If Polaroid had come back to Kodak and say, you know what, hey, we're going to give you a license for our patents, I think Kodak would have been fine to settle. Polaroid had denied this request over and over again because, again, they felt that if Kodak had licenses to the patents, they would develop their own film, their own instant cameras, and it would put Polaroid out of business. So there was just a mismatch. So Kodak really wanted Polaroid to settle, and they were going to drag the discovery as long as possible. I mean, 5 years is a long time. And Polaroid wanted to take this to trial as soon as possible. They wanted to put this in front of a judge or a jury and make their case, and then let the judge or jury decide. So 5 years after Polaroid sues Kodak, the trial starts. Monday, October 5th, 1981 was a sunny, cool, crisp New England day in Boston. Reagan is in the Oval Office, and he is the sixth president that Land has served since his World War II work started. He actually showed a prototype of the SX70 to colleagues at Kodak and to the president as well. Now, we saw the judge earlier in our beginning, Judge Sobel. She was actually the third or the fourth judge to take over this case. Judges did not want this case. They knew, for good reason, that patent infringement cases are highly technical. They are not exciting, at least from their perspective. And many judges sort of punt on the case. So Judge Sobel was about the third or fourth judge that was assigned to this case. And she's the one that then brought the lengthy, excessive discovery to an end. She set the trial date, and she's going to be the one to oversee the trial. There is no jury on this trial, so both sides are making the argument to one person, Judge Sobel. So she has to understand 30 years of technical development by Polaroid, and she has to understand the implications from a legal basis, and then make her decision. Now, Land and Judge Sobel ended up forming a good relationship, this sort of teacher-pupil relationship. We know that Land actually shone, or he really came alive when trying to explain technology, and he was quite good at it, especially to non-technical folks. So this became a big benefit for Polaroid and their case. Apart that when Kodak did cross-examination with Land, he was just very well prepared, right? You know, Polaroid would go on to put on all the actual people who were involved in the development of the SX70 and key patents. People like Land, people like Howard Rogers. So there were the actual scientists who spent years going through thousands of combinations and compounds and ideas and hypotheses to make this camera work. Kodak, on the other hand, did not put on their experts for their own development of the EK4, EK6. They relied primarily on outside experts. And this became something that stood out to the judge and the press in general, that here's Polaroid asking the people who actually did this work to give their perspective, their their expertise. And here's Kodak not bringing on their actual experts to talk about the camera development. When, if you remember, the case boils down to, are the patents valid because the work is groundbreaking or not? Now, the trial lasted for 74 days of testimony. It was almost 5 months. Both sides presented their cases. Polaroid for why the patents were novel, and of course Kodak for why they were not. Now, Judge Sobel did a great job. She really proved to be up to the challenge. She was completely engaged in the process. She took notes. She asked questions. She made sure to understand all the testimony, which you got to remember, right? This is highly technical testimony that's being given in front of her. She had all the written material, and she was determined to do it quickly. By this point in time, it had been 6 years since Kodak had released the cameras, the EK4, EK6, and they had been in the market all those 6 years. So when the trial ends, Kodak had been in the market for 6 years selling the cameras and sort of encroaching on the Polaroid market share. Now, Judge Sobel would take another 3 years and a half to deliberate on all the material and testimony that she heard. It looks like sometime along that process, she had a health battle, I believe cancer, which also delayed her decision. And you gotta remember, she was the only judge, so she had to make the decision herself. And now, since the trial ended, 2 of the Polaroid patents that were part of the trial had actually expired. If you remember, patents are not valid forever. They have an expiration date. And in the trial, when Polaroid sued Kodak, they had decided to look at 10 patents and make that the heart of the trial. So Polaroid had thousands of patents. They boiled down to what they felt was the 10 most powerful, effective patents. And of those 10, 2 had expired since the trial had ended. The other 8 had remaining terms in the range of maybe between 3 and 6 years. So clearly, by this point in time, Kodak was winning. They were still in the market. They were still selling instant cameras and the film that came along with that. And any delay simply hurt Polaroid more than Kodak, as those patents were slowly starting to expire. Now, here's where we come to where we started. Finally, on Friday, September 13, 1985, almost 9 years after Polaroid had sued Kodak, 3.5 years of deliberation, Judge Sobel announced her decision in the landmark case of Polaroid Corporation versus Eastman Kodak Company. Judge Sobel ruled in Polaroid's favor, finding 8 of the 10 Polaroid patents valid, 7 of which she found Kodak guilty of infringing. Now, here's where the case became a huge sort of landmark case in sort of legal history. Judge Sobel then goes on to issue a permanent injunction ordering Kodak to cease using Polaroid's patent technology. Now, more significantly, as Judge Sobel was urged by Polaroid, she refused to stay the injunction pending Kodak's appeal, which of course was going to happen. And she set the effective date of that injunction on January 9th, 1986, just 12 weeks later from when she's announcing this decision. This injunction means that Kodak had to remove all the products off the shelf. The EK4, the EK6, anything that infringed Polaroid's patents had to be removed, taken off the shelves. Any cameras that customers had would overnight become obsolete. Kodak could no longer sell the film. They could no longer sell anything that was possibly infringing on Polaroid. This was a huge decision. Kodak was not expecting an injunction, and they were not expecting an injunction 12 weeks into the future. You imagine a company of Kodak's size, all the distribution and products all over the country, all over the world, to be able to remove them all from the shelves in 12 weeks would be not only difficult, it would be a huge financial loss. Now, Kodak appealed, and it's going to go on through several appeals. So they're going to take an appeal to another court. Initially, they want to appeal the injunction itself, actually, to say, okay, let's remove the injunction and let's go into a full appeal process of the trial itself. So Kodak will go on to do that. And in January 7th, 1986, the appeal of the injunction gets denied in another federal court, which meant that Kodak had to fulfill the injunction only a few days later. Kodak would then actually try to take this appeal one more time into the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then also rejects it. The appeal of the injunction is interesting to note because when another court that was not Judge Sobel refused to reverse Judge Sobel's injunction, they had to go through all the testimony, all the case files. Kodak and Polaroid also had a chance to provide brief testimony during this appeal process. And they agreed that Judge Sobel had done a fantastic job in her process. They did not see any flaws in her reasoning or logic, which meant that any other appeal of the entire case itself was likely doomed to fail since it was already being validated by one court. So Kodak loses the case. It loses the appeal to the injunction, and it will eventually go on to lose any other appeal in general. They have to fulfill the injunction, and they started to remove all the cameras and film from all the store shelves across the country and shuttering the manufacturing operations. Now, it is estimated that fulfilling the injunction cost Kodak a staggering amount of about $500 million. And they also had to deal with lawsuits from their customers. So Kodak customers sued Kodak for for having to remove this product. It's a little funny that way. So they had to spend another $150 million to settle this class action lawsuits from unhappy customers. Now, the case with Polaroid then took another couple years to go through the damages portion. So once all the appeals were run out, all the appeals were denied, then a new judge came on and he decided what were going to be the damages that Kodak had to pay Polaroid for the initial case. On July 16th, 1991, 15 years, 3 months, and 20 days after Polaroid had sued Kodak, the final award was announced. And Kodak had to pay $925 million, more than $1.6 billion in today's dollars, to Polaroid for infringing on patents. It was much less than Polaroid wanted. It was much more than Kodak was thought they needed to pay, but it was historic and unprecedented. So if we tally everything here without converting it to 2024 dollars, Kodak paid about $1 billion to Polaroid for infringing the patents. They had to pay another $500 million when they had to shutter the operations of the instant camera business and they had to pull the cameras and film from the shelves, and $150 million in class action lawsuits. So Kodak ended up paying about $650 to deal with this infringing in patents. Now, it took 15 years for all this to take place. And of course, at the time, Kodak made some revenue, so it wasn't a true 100% loss. But nonetheless, it was a damage to Kodak and the ego and the perception they had. Now, I want to look also at the results of the SX70 culture-wise, because I think it's helpful to look at that as well. We have to understand that the time from the 70s onwards, it was probably the worst recession since World War II. Richard Nixon announces step down in 1974. Gerald Ford inherited this terrible economy, some of the worst inflation in the country's peacetime history. But the camera would go on to have an impact, right? Looking at what individuals felt for the camera, you can see. I mean, they saw that it was a great way to capture moments, right? That there's some nostalgia of taking a photograph, seeing it within a few minutes. We have this today, but it's really the first time that people had this instant gratification for what photos look like. And many people who grew up in the 70s, they remember what it was like to use the SX70 and future variations, right? To look at that distinctive white border snapshots of Polaroid photographs, which we still see today. They were not just images, they were sort of tangible pieces of time, invoking warm memories. People used to shake the photos, which Polaroid confirmed that this is actually not needed, and in some cases it can actually hurt the photograph, so don't shake it. There was so much anticipation and magic when you took a photo with an SX70 and then you saw it. In the video before I mentioned that shows the function of the SX70, you see how families can take 5-10 photos right away, an entire pack, and then you put them on the ground, and as they develop, then you pick your favorite one. Looking at the impact of Polaroid, even beyond that, there's a huge spike in Polaroid in recent times, from basically like 2010 onwards. Gen Z in particular really loves this cameras. Actually, eBay searches for digital cameras have increased 10% from 2021 to 2022. And the instant camera business today is projected to grow to about $1.6 billion by 2029. Gen Z, again, in particular, loves this sort of blurry, smaller photos, the white background and so on. There was a song by Outkast, I think called Heya, that uses Polaroid. And this sort of disposable cameras, instant cameras, just become more popular in recent times, right? There's a nostalgia that's coming back, maybe not for the generation that grew up with it, but for the younger generation. There's an element of authenticity that I think gets captured by a photo, a Polaroid, that digital photos may not quite have. Today, of course, the Instagram square photos are a reflection of that element, right? The Polaroid. Some of the filters are straight up Polaroid, right? Sepia filters and things like that. There were filters that you could get with Polaroids if you manipulate them. And the original logo for Instagram is actually of the Polaroid one-step camera, which would be released after the SX70. And one more thing, if you look at that culture, if you look at the Taylor Swift 1989 cover album, it's a Polaroid of her with that sort of distinct background and so on. So success for the release of the SX70. Polaroid eventually has success in the trial. The culture is heavily affected by Polaroid even today. But we have to look at where the company ended. While this podcast is more focused on the SX70 and that specific strategy, which I think we can agree was successful, especially by the end of the 1970s, I do want to talk briefly about where Polaroid ended up past the 1970s when we look at the 80s, 90s, and then 2000s, because the company will eventually file for bankruptcy. And we can put closure to Edwin Land himself. Part 6. The bottom line is in heaven. 1980s. Now, Reagan took over office on January 20th, 1981. He would stay there until 1989. The Apple II was discontinued in 1983, and it sold between 5 and 6 million computers. We know that Steve Jobs idolized Land and was really starting to trail his own path to sort of tech immortality. Now, Polavision was the next project that Land took on after the SX70, but it failed. Polavision was going to be a portable movie camera business. You hold it with one hand, and it would take about 3 minutes of footage without sound, at least the initial release. It would do in color. Once again, the Polavision product development, the technical development was just incredible. The work that Land were going to do over those 5-10 years to develop Polavision was just fantastic. But the product did not succeed. And it created maybe the end of Land in the Polaroid world. Land he resigned the chief executive position in 1980. In about the mid-70s, he actually resigned some of the presidency among pressure from Wall Street with the SX70. We know that there were issues up to about the mid-70s, and then the SX70 started to do really well. In that period, Land resigned one of his titles. In the 1980, he resigns the chief executive altogether, so he just becomes part of the board. But in 1982, he leaves the company completely. And he completely separates himself actually from the company altogether. So it's clear that some of the downfall that started with the SX70 in the mid-70s then would completely detach Land from Polaroid by 1982. Now, Land had this emotional and tearful plea in the 1982 May annual shareholder meeting. He was asking for patience in turning the company around. So what happened over this time? Now, Polavision was a commercial disaster. Customers found it uncompelling. Its $3,500 price in today's dollars was daunting. Again, you could do about 2 minutes and a half of film, no sound. And at the time, the film that was becoming more popular was the 8mm film, and it cannot be viewed in existing projectors. So the Polavision system actually came with its own little TV projector system, a 12-inch projection screen. There was no way to edit the film. It was a closed system. Now, 2 years earlier, Sony had introduced the Betamax VCR, and JVC had introduced the VHS recorders, which would become the more common way to record video. Polaroid discontinued Polavision 2 years later in 1979. So for decades, Land's instinct for instant products seemed to be questioned. Polavision was a misstep for Land. They felt that the SX70 was announced prematurely in 1972, which led to 2-3 years of issues with quality and demand. And in 1975, the board helped Land to step down as president, and Chief McCune took over that role. So this allowed Land to focus more on the research side. Land gives up this title in 1980, resigns in 1972, and in 1985, he actually sells all his stock of Polaroid, and he effectively cuts all ties with the company. So by 1985, he moves on completely. He creates something called the Roland Institute, where he goes on to just spend all his time doing technical research. Now, Polaroid, from the 80s onwards, is kind of working on some interesting projects, but is not really able to take them to fruition. When Land leaves the company, Polaroid actually had 2 projects in the research pipeline, one for printing, inkjet printing, and another called the, quote, filmless electronic photography. Now, Polaroid will go on to release digital cameras, but it never quite makes the market work. Now, something that's intriguing to know here is that if you remember from the film satellite conversation, Land advocated for a digital satellite, and if there was a person on Earth who knew a lot about digital imaging, it's probably Land. He had seen it early stages with the military work, with the satellites. He was the visionary who pushed the satellites away from film and into digital. But yet, he never quite made the same leap for Polaroid. It may have been that from the mid-70s onwards, his relationship inside the company was more difficult. There was more pushback from executives, from shareholders, and maybe he wasn't as willing to take on a new major project. It could also be that for Polaroid, digital maybe makes sense for a military application, but there really wasn't a use case for consumer applications just yet, not in the 70s or early 80s. If you look at the revenue, the revenue Polaroid will continue to climb. So it does continue to climb all the way to about late 90s, and then it just drops completely in the 2000s when Polaroid files for bankruptcy. The stock price never quite recovers from that 1975 drop. It just kind of hovers there, and again, somewhere in the mid 90s, it peaks and then it comes down. One thing to note is that when the Polavision was demonstrated to different people, they actually brought Morita, who was leading Sony at the time, and he felt, when the Polavision demonstration ended, Land asked Morita, what do you think? And Morita responded, well, you can sell 50,000 units of anything. It's an unbelievable scientific development, but you're too late. Sony, of course, will go on to take over some of the video recorder market. Now, around this time, one analyst asked Land about the bottom line for Polavision. And Land issued one of his most famous retorts, right? Where he replies, the bottom line is in heaven. Now, at this point in time, Land's retorts were perhaps not as accepted blindly as they were in the past. Shareholders and executives did not have the same level of faith in Land as before, right? They were seeing the Polavision crash. The SX70 was successful, but there were all these issues that perhaps could have been avoided. And as Land started to be removed from titles, the question or the topic around succession started to become more prevalent. Now, the issue, and something that Fortune magazine wrote about, is that, quote, there's no number 2 man in Cambridge, where Polaroid is based, only a group of number 3s. And a lot of 3s had long felt under-recognized. Working in such a long shadow was hard on ambitious and talented people. So we see that one of the issues Land had was that even though he created world-class scientists, he did not spend enough time on leadership. And there really wasn't a clear successor to him after it. And of course, some under-recognition was a bit of a pattern with Land. We saw that with Kodak, right? One of the factors that eventually led Kodak to start a legal proceeding or to go into the instant photography market. So as Land leaves the company has a bit of a void as to how it's going to release products, right? And Polaroid doesn't really release anything novel after the SX70, even in the next 20, 30 years. It will go on to do digital cameras and other types of instant cameras, but it seems like the effort to do heavy, impossible research work went away with Land. Fun fact, McCune, who took over from Land as president, actually developed money to create a microelectronics lab to really look at this nascent field of digital imaging. It's a pretty bold move. This is somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s. And he felt that if you have good technical people, you shouldn't be afraid of going into whole new technical areas. And by the 1980s, Polaroid, in a joint venture with Philips, was creating a digital sensor that could produce a 1.2 megapixel image. And eventually it would become the leader in instant imaging. But digital imaging just wasn't enough to save Polaroid. Now, in 1978, Polaroid had more than 20,000 employees. Within a couple of years, the labor started to be reduced. And by 1991, there were substantial cuts. It stabilized at about 5,000 employees. And the $1 billion Kodak settlement, which we saw in 1991, helped to prop up his bank accounts. But even a decade later, by 2001, Polaroid was bankrupt. Now, 1979 was a difficult year for Polaroid. Its earnings plummeted 70% from $118 million in 1978 to $36 million in 1979. Its stock lost value. It kept going down. And this led to sort of the tearful plea that we saw before 1982 with Polaroid. As Land had one of his last annual shareholder meetings, he really asked shareholders for the support. He wanted not in terms of money, but support in terms of enjoyment of the creative life. Again, this is what for Land was the most important thing. The creative life, the ability to do something deeply, to dedicate yourself, to find your life work. Now, when Land left the company, the company was in relatively solid financial shape. Even though the stock was fluctuating, it did not have a lot of debt yet. It had about $300 million in cash and very little debt. But it was not clear what the company would do after. Now, over time, what's going to happen to Polaroid is as they took more of the initial internal manufacturing, which we saw with the SX70, their debt increases, sales go down, they have to reduce workforce, and the company just becomes bloated and inefficient as the years go on, even though they're releasing more and more products, which are effectively variations of the instant photography system. Now, Land goes on to the Roland Institute, and he really established this motto of you should never go to bed with a hypothesis untested. I like this quote here from a Boston Globe writer called Stephen Sire that he felt that what happened to Polaroid is one day Polaroid stopped dreaming of the future and soon found itself living in the past. Now, Edwin Land died in 1981. He did see the trial finish. He did see that the appeals were denied and the Polaroid had won, so that was closer to that. And remember, by 1991, it had already been about 6 years since he had any involvement with Polaroid at all. He completely cut all ties. When he died, he had 536 patents to his name, third in U.S. history to Thomas Edison and Elijah Thomas at the time. These two men were the men whose companies merged in 1892 to form General Electric. He had a lot of honorary degrees from all kinds of universities, including Harvard, Yale, Columbia. He received virtually every distinction the scientific community has to offer, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the National Medal of Science, the National Inventors Hall of Fame, and membership in the prestigious Royal Society of London. I think all of us use the polarizer just about every day, right? Whether we're using sunglasses, camera filters, LCD displays, scientific instruments, car windshields. Land actually had this pet project around the theory of color vision, like how we view colors. And his work in that field will go on to become groundbreaking later on. And of course, we'll get an even more clear picture of his influence in the defense and intelligence efforts over 30, 40 years. So Land dies, hugely influential. Company he built, successful, though the company now struggling. He's no longer part of it. He had an amazing life, right? Whatever way we look at it, it's just an incredible life, incredible influence and impact in this industry and the world around him. Now, a couple of things here, just to finalize here, on the industry side, in the 1970s, photographers were shooting 1 billion Polaroid photographs a year. And then eventually the whole business vanished, right? Right around the year 2000, pictures taken went digital and film disappeared from the market. Any company that depended on selling and processing film, aka Kodak and Polaroid, had really rough years of realignment after this time. Kodak also had its peak sometime in the late 1980s. They had about 45,000 employees, and eventually they came down to fewer than 20,000, and they filed for bankruptcy in 2012. Polaroid, by 2001 was really struggling with long-standing debt that had been built over the time, and they filed for bankruptcy themselves. The company actually came back in late 2010s or something with the Polaroid Impossible project. So you can actually find Polaroids today. It's a smaller company. They use the same technology and film. You can go online and see that. But this is the end of that sort of Edwin Land era. Now, if you look at the digital imaging, I really thought about this a lot. People sometimes say, oh, Polaroid just didn't move on to digital cameras, which is actually not true. And, in 2001, Polaroid had one of the best-selling digital cameras in the market. But when Land was still in charge, the comparisons just were nowhere possible. If you consider this, a frame of medium format codec film holds the equivalent of 80 million pixels of digital data. The same space on the screen of an Apple II computer held just 243 pixels, 243 versus 80 million. And it took a couple minutes to boot up the computer. Why would anyone bother? So for Land and Polaroids, digital didn't make any sense, right? It wasn't powerful enough to capture the entire image. There was really nothing that was yet enough to show the image properly, and nothing that seemed better than an actual physical format photo in your hands. Now, the Kodak, the Polaroid market share in instant photography dropped from 27% to 17% from 1978 to 1982. Kodak took some of that. If you remember, Kodak is still in the market, right? The injunction will not take place until the late 80s. But the bigger issue that Polaroid had, and Kodak actually, was that the film processing went from several days, we saw earlier, to actually 1 hour processing films. You may have remembered this if you're old enough. You could drop your film at a grocery store, and 1 hour later, the images would get processed. So this 1 hour processing film was hugely detrimental to Polaroid. All of a sudden, if the comparison is you take a Polaroid and then you get a picture in 5 minutes, or you take a bunch of pictures using disposable cameras and disposable film, you put it at the grocery store, you do your shopping, and you come back, that's not bad, right? You got to remember that the Polaroid photos were good when it was the only option, but the disposable cameras actually took better quality photos than just a Polaroid. Plus, you can get different sizes and things like that. So the 1 hour processing film really put a dent on the Polaroid market, on the instant market. Disposable cameras came with a 35mm film, which was standard. So you could buy different cameras. You can buy same film. It wasn't proprietary, and this was a major issue for Polaroid. Now, Sony introduced the first portable video camcorder, which became popular in the 80s. Again, Polavision could not compete here. It was never an issue. If you look at some of the strategic mistakes that Polaroid made, there were a few. They perhaps didn't adjust to digital technologies as well as they could have. They did not become a software company effectively. They were too bloated, technology, depth-wise. So when revenue dropped significantly in the late 90s, early 2000s, they could not deal with that. They were too adjusted to this high print media, right? They had to be in some kind of physical form. It was said that perhaps the culture in Polaroid was built very heavy on chemistry in particular, and they did not really have respect for hardware. That is, they didn't want to make money on the hardware itself. They wanted to make money on the film. And just like Kodak, anything that affected film was a no-go, right? So Kodak will go on to have the same issue. As digital camera removes film, where's the business model, right? So Polaroid might see digital cameras, but they might say, well, where's the money, right? If film is where we can make our money, how can we possibly do it with digital film? So Kodak and Polaroid would suffer from the same issue. You got to keep in mind that instant film had gross margins of 65% or more. So where's the gross margin for digital? The answer is probably somewhere in the software, but this is too early for Polaroid to even think about that. Now, let's finish here with some of the legacy of Polaroid. The most obvious one is, of course, Apple. They very similar companies. Jobs really model himself after Land. If you look at some of the advertisements in magazines, the product releases that Jobs used to do, very similar to Land. They were both, similar individuals. They both dropped from college. They were both obsessed with refining their products. Land, of course, was a scientist himself. He was working on the products. Jobs, less so. but they both have similar influence. I think the invention that Land had for the annual shareholders meeting is quite interesting to see. Changing the shareholders meeting to something that is exciting, that is something that people want to be part of, and something, again, you think about Jobs and how much people will watch a product release now because of that. I love this comment here where during this annual shareholders meetings, the atmosphere was so positive towards Land that if a critic tried to ask him a difficult question, which weren't very common, Land would step in and say, no, you know what? Let him speak. Perfectly reasonable question. Please let him finish. And then all of a sudden, this reverse psychology would kick in where now the critic was all of a sudden being defended by Land himself. And it kind of softened the blow. Many of the questions that Land received during his shareholders meetings were really more like, what do you call it, like softballs, easy balls. They would ask him, how long did it take you to develop color film? What are you going to invent next? And so on. So they were not difficult meetings. So by the time it gets to the 1980s, and they are more difficult because the company's struggling and there's less faith in Land to release a new product, that's a different environment. What's interesting is that if you look at instant photography today, it has sort of come around 180. And now instant photography with Polaroid today as a company, but just in general, it is true art. It is not about building this highly profitable company. The medium has become art, which I think is what Land wanted, but he was forced to deal with the economics of how you make a commercial product and how you run a company and all that. So instant photography today might be actually closer to what Land truly envisioned for Polaroid and his company. Now Land disliked any biography attempts. There were a couple books that were done about him. He did not authorize them. He was not happy with them. He regarded his scientific papers as his essential biography. And interesting enough, when he died, his family went through and they actually burned a lot of his personal papers. So I think Land is referring to specifically the things that were published and on the record. A lot of the records were again, deleted by his family. I also think it's helpful to know here that the approach that Land took his work had a toll. There's evidence that Land did not have a close relationship with his family, or at least there were strained relationship with his wife and his children, maybe with close friends. So it wasn't something that just didn't affect his life, right? His obsession with work, his obsession with invention and solving problems did affect his personal life in some way. It hasn't really been spoken about. You don't see too much of it. You sort of see it in some whispers and some comments here and there, but it's something to keep in mind. And again, another parallel with Steve Jobs, right? Who also had some family issues growing up because of his approach to work. So that's everything. That's Polaroid. That is the XX70. That is Edwin Land. That is the good, the bad, where Polaroid ended after Edwin Land moved away. It is a fantastic episode. And I think I want to close it with a quote from Land. Every section of this podcast has started with a quote from Land. This Land-isms, as they are sometimes called. So I want to finish with one. I want to give Land the final word here. So this is Land. I quote, "Over the years, I have learned that every significant invention has several characteristics. By definition, it must be startling, unexpected, and must come into a world that is not prepared for it. If the world were prepared for it, it would not be much of an invention." And that's everything for the third episode of Stratagems. If you enjoyed this episode, I'll ask you for a few things. One, if you can leave a review in the Apple Store. This is the Apple Podcast Store. That's really helpful to others and for the growth of the podcast. So I really appreciate that. Second, send me your comments or questions by email. You'll find my email on my website and in the podcast description and a bunch of other places. I'd love to hear that. I'd love to hear what you're thinking, what you like, what you think can be improved. It says this is the third episode so far. I'm already working on the fourth episode. I'm excited for that. I'll have more details of that soon, but always loving to hear what people are thinking. And finally, make sure to subscribe from your favorite podcast app, whether the Apple app or Spotify or anywhere else you can listen to your podcast. There's a few links in the podcast description, including a weekly newsletter I have, which I think if you like the ideas here, this strategic breakdowns and strategic insights, you'll like that weekly newsletter. It is short, fewer than 5 minutes, and it goes out every week versus the podcast, which goes out every 6 weeks, every 2 months. There's also going to be a link to the show's sources. So any of the books, links, videos that I read, they're all there. It's about a page and a half of sources. And there's a bonus content as well that I collected along the way. Some of the videos I mentioned multiple times as we've gone along. So check those out. And until next time, my name is Ruben Ugarte. We'll talk soon.